Technological unemployment. Is it a blessing or a curse? Now, the US Treasury Secretary said this on technological unemployment. And this was very recent, by the way. It was on 27th of March, 2017. He said that we are 50 to 100 years away from artificial intelligence taking over jobs, where so far is not even on my radar. So the US Treasury Secretary, the one serving right now, believes that statement. It's not even on his radar. Now, I find this particularly interesting because the last administration published a report on December 2016 where they claimed that artificial intelligence and robots could replace 47% of US jobs by 2036. So not in 50 years, not in 100 years, 2036. And in fact, if you read the report and you go a bit deeper, that's at the low end. In fact, at the high end, it can go up to 81% of certain jobs. So I don't know what this person was reading, but the executive office of the President of the United States published this report. So we already have conflicting statements from the United States government. And they say 2036, but in fact, others say 2029. So Google's Ray Kurzweil predicts robots will reach human levels of intelligence by 2029. That's at The Guardian, that's 2015. And if you keep reading the different reports, that number goes lower and lower. So here you have another one, 2025. Experts predict robots will take over 30% of our jobs by 2025. And white-collar jobs aren't immune. Business Insider 2015, May. And that's the robot Baxter on that picture. So not 50 years, not 100 years, but 2025. And now if you look at what's happening today, Foxconn replaced 60,000 factory workers with robots in 25th of May, 2016, according to BBC. So it's not 50 years, not 100 years. It's happening today, right now. In fact, last year. So I'm not so sure I can believe what the US Secretary of the Treasury is saying, because the facts are proving his statement at least a little bit misleading given what's happening. And in fact, all the publications, they're talking about white-collar jobs are already being taken. So here are 5 examples, from financial sports reporters to e-discovery lawyers to online marketers. These jobs are increasingly being taken by AI and other kinds of technology. It's already happening. We don't have to wait 50 years. And in fact, if you've been reading the news, it's not just easy tasks that are being taken over by AI. Here you have the first AI lawyer being hired by an official law firm. That happened in 2016. And the first AI creative director that was hired by McCann, 2016. So this is last year. It's already happening. And it's going to get faster. And a lot more people are going to be losing their jobs to technology. In fact, I actually just read that insurers, a Swiss insurer agency, started using AI to determine which claims to approve and which not. I just read about it today. So it's happening across the board. Now, surely, technological automation has happened like that. Some people say.
Right? Wrong.
It hasn't. It has not happened that way before. And I can demonstrate this. Give me just 1 second to put back my... So the reason why it hasn't happened before in just exactly the same way is because of a number of reasons. But I'm just pointing out this a little graph here as a sort of example. But before I go on, I just want to make sure like the sound is working properly, just by checking. Okay, it seems to be working properly. Sorry about that interruption. So what I say with this graph here is that around 2000, you have a sort of like difference that's start happening between productivity and employment. You see productivity going up, but there's not a corresponding increase in the number of jobs that accompanies that productivity. And you see that started happening in 2000, and it's getting worse. And it's not something that has happened before, at least since the 1947, when that data was started to be collected. And there's more reasons than just this one, because I had mentioned that in a previous presentation, but now I've got more data. So why is it different this time? Why is technological employment different this time? This is a report by the University of Oxford and Citibank, published January 2016, and they list 3 reasons. 1, the pace of change has accelerated. 2, the scope of technological change is increasing. And 3, the benefits of technological change are not being widely shared. Real median wages have fallen behind growth in productivity, and inequality has increased. The third one was kind of implied in the yellow slide that I showed. But these are just 3 differences, but there's actually more than just 3. So if you go to like a different article by Rohr this time, published on 25th of June 2016, they talk about how in the earliest periods of automation, there was a concurrent major effort by the labor movement to reduce the working week, which spread the remaining work around more evenly. Therefore, it wasn't felt that like acutely. Then, obviously, after the Second World War, economies were in ruins, so there was like massive influx of money, especially from the States. There were full employment policies, and especially like a compact between the trade unions and capital to maintain a sufficient amount of good jobs in place. And obviously, like, women who had not really, joined the workforce yet, right? And of course, now, none of this is true. We're not in that period anymore. So other than the 3 reasons I already mentioned, none of these things are true anymore. So it's totally different this time. And of course, to go back to the title of the presentation, okay, it's probably happening. It might not happen, exactly the way that some experts have predicted, but it's probably happening. So how can that be a curse? Obviously, there's many ways. I'm just gonna go through a few. First one was pointed out by Nero Rubini from the New York Stern School of Business. It's a professor there. Of course, the question is, where will all the workers go? All these people are going to be losing their jobs. Where are they going to go? It might not be very easy to kind of transform everyone into a coder overnight. And especially given that some of those workers are going to be losing their jobs, are not going to necessarily be residing in Western or developed nations where opportunities for re-education are present. But in fact, to go to the next slide, robots and AI will replace 2/3 of all workers in the developing world, right? And that's from the United Nations, 2016. Which means that if you thought that the refugee crisis was bad, wait till basically it's combined with technological unemployment from the developing world. And 2/3 of all workers there remaining unemployed. Where do you think these people are going to go? They're always going to want to go where affluence is and where they could potentially get a job. So it's going to make the issue of migration even more complicated than it already is. And these are reports that are not taken from some off mainstream weird publication. This is from the United Nations. So reputable reports are pointing that out, ringing the bell of danger for us to start thinking about these issues. And I don't believe that we're thinking about them enough. In fact, it's not only the technological unemployment that's important, but it's also the fact that most of what kids currently learn at school will probably be irrelevant by the time they're 40, because things are going so fast that what we learn and what we'll need to learn in order for us to remain in the workforce is different. So what we need to do is we need to actually radically rethink our educational systems and have them change fast to keep pace with technological progress. If we don't, even young people in developed countries will not have the skills to be able to be part of the workforce, whatever problems that generates. Of course, the question is also, who will own the robots and the AI? Would it be essentially like everyone, or would it just be those people who essentially are creating them? And if you look at some of the stats, it doesn't look good, because the world's 8 richest people have as much wealth as the bottom half. In other words, 8 billionaires own the same wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people. I want you to think about that a bit, because it's such an extraordinary disparity that it's mind-boggling. And this is January 2017. It's relatively recent, and you can see how once you have extraordinary productivity generated by AI and robots, probably the people who are going to take advantage of that are the people who are already, with the resources to either build it or commission the research and so forth. So that's probably what's going to happen, and that may not be the scenario that we're looking for with respect to having an equitable world. So, okay, how about solutions? Are there any solutions to this problem? How could it potentially change from a developing curse to a developing blessing? So can we have some solutions? First of all, people think that perhaps things are not that bad. This is a new study, May 2016, and they were criticizing earlier studies by saying, well, destruction of large numbers of jobs, probably unlikely. But if you look at the details, the numbers they put at that table are still important. So for example, if you have 10% of the United Kingdom, or 9% with high risk of losing their jobs, that's still thousands or millions of people, especially when we have all these countries that are going to be affected. So, okay, it might not be 43 or 46 or 80, but still, even 12% across all these countries is going to be a big deal. So at least though, this tempers potentially our fears, given that we're not so sure, how large that number is going to be. But that isn't really a solution. It's just let's not freak out completely, because perhaps our numbers are wrong. So one solution that suggested by Bill Gates, who was one of the 8 billionaires that was mentioned earlier, is perhaps robots should be taxed like humans. And I have a little video of his just to make the point when I play it for you guys.
The human worker does $50,000 worth of work in a factory, that income is taxed. If the robot comes in to do the same thing, you'd think that we'd tax the robot at a similar level. What the world wants is to take this opportunity to make all the goods and services we have today and free up labor, let us do a better job of reaching out to the elderly, having smaller class size, helping kids with special needs. Now, all of those are things where human empathy and understanding are still very, very unique, and we still deal with an immense shortage of people to help out there. And so if you can take the labor that used to do the thing automation replaces, and both financially and training-wise and fulfillment-wise, have that person go off and do these other things, you're net ahead. But you can't just give up that income tax, because that's part of how you've been funding that level of human workers. Some of it can come on the profits that are generated by the labor-saving efficiency there. Some of it can come directly in some type of robot tax. I don't think the robot companies are going to be outraged that it might be a tax. It's okay.
Bill Gates thought about this issue, perhaps could be one of the solutions. Let's go to another solution that a lot of people are talking about. That solution basically is that of basic income. Now, obviously that's a topic in and of itself that I could talk for quite a bit, but I want to focus on one of the quotes that I put in right there. Now, in the Silicon Valley, essentially the metaphor is like, it's going to be like VC for the people. So you're going to be able to fund people to not have to struggle for their daily subsistence, given that technology is going to be taking care of most of it, and that will enable like entrepreneurship because people are going to have the basics covered, and that will allow for more risk, and therefore VC for the people. But I want to focus a bit more on the idea of a social vaccine for the 21st century by Scott Santens, and that was published on Medium, 6th of February 2015. So this idea, this argument for basic income, draws from draws an analogy essentially between vaccines, like real vaccines, and basic income, and it being a social vaccine. So what's that analogy? So when societies, especially Western societies, spend a lot of money trying to build vaccines and like distribute them for free against some like major diseases, some people did the math as to how much money was saved by vaccinating people. It's like purely in economic terms, without like considering the human cost and all of that. And the kind of numbers they came up with were very encouraging. For every dollar that we spent on a vaccine, saved from $3 to $7. So the return on investment that we made on like getting everybody vaccinated was pretty good. Actually made even financial sense to do so. What Scott is saying here is that just as we saved a lot of medical bills and a lot of people basically and not being not checking into work because they were sick, and all sorts of other things when it came to like normal vaccines, the same goes for poverty. Poverty has externalities. Poverty costs societies money. When somebody's poor, that doesn't mean that we can just forget about them in some corner. It creates a number of problems, not only for themselves, but for others. There are basically hospital bills. Somebody who's poor has a larger chance of potentially committing crimes. So that means that we have to spend more time on policing. Then there's obviously all the money that we give to social welfare programs. So it's not as if poverty is free. And what he's saying is that a similar case can be made with respect to basic income. That it's like a social vaccine for the 21st century, where you give some money to people in need, to everyone essentially, and you make poverty history, and you save money on all those other things that we're currently paying for. Irrespective of whether you believe that it's something that we morally ought to do, even like from a financial, cold financial, numbers point of view, it actually might make sense. So, there's people working on those numbers, and I think he has published some of them in his article. So this is for all of those people who are saying that it will cost so much money and all that stuff. Well, these people are making the argument that actually will save us money. So I'm just suggesting you read this article because it's a very interesting argument. So that's another way that we can potentially manage or respond to technological unemployment. And there's more. Some people are suggesting fully automated luxury communism. This idea is that it's pretty much the idea that, look, now with AI and robots, we can do the utopia that Marx thought about. I mean, no one has to work. We can just basically build all those robots. They can work for us. They can be shared and owned by everyone, and we can be living in a technological utopia. Now, obviously, there are many arguments potentially against that. All I'm saying is that there has been a resurgence of that ideal. And perhaps there's some good arguments there, but perhaps some of the old arguments against communism might still hold. I'm just putting it out there because it has been discussed and it's public and people are talking about it. Another idea, which is essentially like the kind of approach that I'm suggesting, is based on a different approach with respect to like tackling technological unemployment. Because my problem is that if the state starts giving out basic incomes, then essentially the citizens become dependent on the state for their livelihood. And especially if you hold a classical Republican idea of what freedom is when you're not in the status of slavery, and slavery is when your will depends on the will of another. Now, in the case of basic income, you would be dependent on the will of the government to keep giving you that money. And therefore, essentially, you'd be formally in a state of servitude. And of course, as we know, states sometimes cannot really be trusted with that kind of power, because what will happen if at some point they start discriminating as to who's going to get that basic income? People are saying that basic income is all universal and unconditional, but I'm not so trusting that governments will keep their end of the bargain. And in such a scheme, they have the power with respect to who's going to get the money. And if we have leaders that are not of that philosophy, perhaps they might be choosing who's going to get the money. So it creates a situation of dependence. So with a regenerating freedom sort of like approach, what you're doing is you're taking the technology and you're giving it to the people so that they themselves apply it and become free from necessity. Now, by necessity, I mean the basic needs. So if you read that like big sentence here, we're talking about like creating an open to everyone, like replicable, anyone can replicate it anywhere, adaptive to the circumstances of each individual, decentralized, not owned by any like single government or institution, regenerative, in other words, working with nature and not against it, and not just sustaining it, but potentially like improving it. Iterative, meaning that people are working on it, especially if it's open, everybody's like contributing it and making it better and better as a system, as a framework. And that system basically being dedicated to the minimization of unwanted human labor and the maximization of spare time, obviously without harming the environment, depending on the government, or requiring the servitude of others. Now, the last part obviously might got a bit of explanation. What I mean by the servitude of others is essentially the discrepancy that usually happens even today when developing countries have very cheap labor, and often they power our technology or our supply chain in a way that essentially amounts to sort of servitude, whether that's sweatshops for the fashion industry or whatnot. We've seen it a number of times, lax regulations, environmental regulations in developing countries. The kind of system that I imagine would not be based on on sweatshops or servitude to others. It would be purely technological, and it would aim for full automation if possible. Something that anyone could implement it anywhere in the world for a low cost and achieve a dignified life. By dignified, I mean at least covering the basic necessities, or perhaps it might require some hours of maintenance or putting it together. But the idea is, if you want to, an end product of this idea would be for potentially a website where anyone can go and fill out a questionnaire of sorts. How many people are you? 3 people. What sort of climate you're in? We're in a Mediterranean climate, for example. What sort of land do you have available? We have this amount of land, and potentially what sort of tools or what sort of money do you have? And once you fill in a bunch of information, then what that system does is it provides you for a roadmap by which you can implement those technologies and achieve freedom from necessity by automating power and potentially automating food through robotic farm robots, essentially. I mean, that's how they call them. And ideally, you could even potentially download the digital designs of the tools themselves and potentially like print them out to digital printers, like 3D printers. I mean, ideally you could potentially like have a printer that prints another printer, and then like all these printers are printing the tool that you download. So you could potentially like lower the cost and make it very, very cheap for you to print the tools that will allow you to become free. Now, the important part and what I keep mentioning with this approach is that you have the power. You have the ability to implement this on a piece of land, and then you become free without requiring the assistance of the government. Obviously, you might not be able to like necessarily like print everything or build everything yourself, but if you at least have the basic needs covered by technology, you could potentially like use that leverage to educate yourself, retrain yourself without necessarily being a burden, given that I'm assuming that at least when it comes to like, the internet, it's pretty much gonna be like very cheap as it is right now, or potentially like, free. And this doesn't require necessarily a change of government to implement. You could implement something like this without having to change the government. So it can completely happen in a staggered approach, as a hybrid approach, where you start like implementing this kind of like framework, you still keep your day job, and when it gets to the point where you don't really have to work for your necessities, you could quit your job, retrain yourself, and then get another job or do whatever it is that you want to do. So I'm not saying that you should like quit everything that it is that you're doing and like do this, or that a revolution is necessary for this to be implemented. This can be implemented with the laws that people have today. Whereas when it comes to like basic income policies, you would need to convince the government and other people that this should be implemented. Whereas this doesn't require that. We couldn't start tomorrow if we gather a bunch of people and start working on these technologies. In fact, many of those technologies already exist, so it would be a matter of cherry picking them and putting them together. In some sense, like what I'm envisioning to make like a joke out of it in some sense is essentially like making Aristotle's dream come true. And it's not that funny in some sense, but you can actually make it happen. So like Aristotle, this is Greek, I'll just translate it. This is from the Politics. It basically says that if every tool could be ordered or could sense its purpose or its function, then employers would have no need for workers, nor would masters have any needs for slaves. Today, we have that option. We can build tools that can be ordered or sense our needs and start, implementing their function or responding to our needs. Like we can make this happen. It's already happening. So the whole idea is like, why don't we take the technology and the knowledge that we already have and put them in the service of mankind, emancipating people, and perhaps creating a non-profit sort of IKEA, where just in IKEA, when you like take different pieces of wood and you assemble them together and you have a piece of furniture, you can have like an IKEA for freedom, where you take different technologies, you assemble them together, and in the end you get freedom from necessity. And then you can use that freedom to do whatever you want, whether basically you can retrain yourself or get into politics or become an artist. It doesn't matter. It will be up to you, not up to any government or up to anyone else. So that's kind of like the last sort of potentially solution to technological unemployment. Now, what I want to stress here is that this is a problem that is happening today, and it's not happening in 50 to 100 years, like the Treasury Secretary basically mentioned. And it's important to ask ourselves, we who are listening to this video, if it's not going to be us who is building or thinking about this issue, who's it going to be? And if we're not going to be doing it now, when all these like thousands of people are going to be looking for a job because there won't be any jobs available to them because AI and robots have like taken them over. We have to act today for this issue if we are to prevent the deluge of unemployment that's going to come in the next years. And I don't see governments doing enough to prepare for this eventuality. All the experts are talking about it, but I still haven't seen a lot of action from many of the governments. Obviously, like Finland and a bunch of other governments are making some basic income pilots. There's been a number of them. that have been like happening around the world. So that's promising. At least they're like testing one of the solutions to technological unemployment. But this should be one of the issues that Congress people, instead of like arguing about like lesser important things, should be arguing about this in Congress right now, or in their local governments, or in their legislatures. This is something that has to be on the front pages of a number of news, because it's going to radically change our world. So in some sense, I'm setting this question up for you as a challenge, so you can put it in your mind, start thinking about it, talk about it with your friends, and start doing something about it. I'm open basically to discuss this. I do want potentially to work on this, because I do think that like the revolutionary potential of people not having to work for a living can be immense. I mean, Oscar Wilde called it the birth of a new Hellenism, and that's why, because the Greeks did escape necessity, but they used slaves to do so. But if we use machines, then it will be even better than the Greeks, because we will have the freedom without paying the moral price or moral shame that they paid by using other human beings. We can do that with machines, and we can usher a new era of civilization, what John Maynard Keynes called the golden age of leisure, where we focus on how to live agreeably and well. So this is our challenge. I think this is one of the key issues of today. And I challenge you to think about this, and potentially let's discuss it after this presentation, because it's going to be important. So perhaps we can change this, this scenario which is happening right now, to something akin to this, because there's all these maker communities out there, and this presentation was given at the Maker Faire in Athens, so that's why you have this slide. But you have those maker communities, and instead of just making 3D printed objects and all that stuff, you can start focusing on something that has a bigger social impact. We can use the maker communities to start creating these technologies that, in some sense, they're already doing that, but perhaps have a bit more focused approach on tackling technological unemployment. So it's definitely possible to exert some pressure on those communities to start thinking about the issue. So we can finally have a better idea of a future with robots, and not the kind of weird stuff that we read about them taking our jobs and them dominating the world. It's possible to have a technological future where man and machine are actually having fun together, rather than one winning over the other, or vice versa. I do think it's possible, and I definitely hope it happens. So that's the presentation. I'm going to open it to questions right now. This is my website, and that's my Twitter handle. So if you have a question, you can either go through the Google Hangout and kind of ask it directly. I did send you that link, or you can just type it at the chat in YouTube Live. So I'm going to basically transition this to my face, and we can perhaps start a discussion. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna open Ivo's mic here. Hey, Ivo.
I don't have a question. I'm just.
All right.
I have quite a few notes which I'll share with everybody, actually.
By the way, okay, this is a real fan. Okay, so let me first of all, Ivo, you said that you weren't watching my screen at all. You couldn't see my screen.
No, I was just seeing your face. But when you switched Bill Gates and the videos, I wasn't seeing the presentation, so I was just listening.
God. Sorry about that. There was a bunch of stuff that I was showing, essentially after Bill Gates. This was one of the slides. Can you see it right now? Or not? Probably not. Give me 1 second.
But it made sense. It was all understandable, even with the sound only.
That's good. That's good because that sucked essentially. But I'm gonna basically just go through them without talking. I'm just gonna show them you guys. You can ask the question as the slides are. I mean, it made sense. So I guess that's nice that it did. But what was your question?
I didn't have a question.
You didn't have a question?
No. I have so many notes, I'll just share them with everybody.
Okay, so why don't I? So if you don't have a question, do you have any comments, perhaps?
Quite a few. I have like so many notes here, and I mean that's called debate. Like can go to so many directions, and you know there is like a lot of on the side that automation is good. Everybody becomes a music producer and dancer or cook or philosopher or whatever, and we live all happy. And the robots make all the shitty work for us. On the other hand, is the problem of who owns the robots, like whether they'll be exploiting humans and all that stuff. Like, and you can find pluses and minuses in both and arguments for both. But I think that the biggest problem actually seems that the pace of automation becomes much faster, and we cannot reach it in other areas, such as education, which is the biggest problem in my opinion. Second is the pace. We actually, the 1% of disparity, like the few percent of the people that become like the richest, they have so much disparity to the poorest, and one part is education. But there is another problem in that, like the 5% of the richest people in the world don't work less, they actually work more. So we don't have free time. So there is a big, basically, disparity between the pace of automation and the pace of actually we don't have more free time. We become more of a slaves of our own sort of system, and that's a huge problem. And generally, all these kind of things can be solved. AI and all these kind of things, they can make education better. You know, all these things with like Duolingo for languages and Khan Academy for mathematics, and there are so many things that use AI actually to learn to the type of educational sort of behavior you have and learn faster and so on. Basically, automation can bring us more free time, and by having free time and money, we'll probably look for other things like, you know, yoga lessons or whatever. And many people will actually then fit in and be capable of getting jobs. The problem here is that all these things are super synchronized, and that's kind of where I see the problem. And you know, these are things that to me the biggest thing is education. And if you provide more tools to people to be educated, not education in a sense that they all need to learn to code, they only need to be exposed to more activities, more skills, more of a common sense to become just better human beings, and then they'll fit in. Because there are many jobs that we actually don't think of existing. You know, I need a fashion designer or something like that, which many people have the skills. You know, I need a music person who arranges the music in my office. I don't know. There's so many things that they can think of. It's just that people would become less and less educated, less and less aware of what is happening in the world, less and less exposed to the right type of information. And this is where actually the solutions of all the problems lie, in my opinion. It was long argument, but I just like, there are many thoughts that I kind of had. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I do think that the time issue is a big deal. In fact, like, you know, we've talked about this because, you know, we don't know each other. In some sense, like, it has been a question for some scholars. In fact, there's the book by Benjamin Honeycutt. It's called Free Time, The Forgotten American Dream. And the reason why he named it that way is because the American dream used to be about free time. It didn't used to be about, it wasn't about like a lot of products and you like watching sports. In fact, like, you know, the great American poet Walt Whitman talked about the idea of higher progress and how essentially, like, you know, with a lowering of work hours, we'll reach a point where we'll only be working about like 2 hours a day, and then we can dedicate the rest to politics, philosophy, arts, and so forth. So in some sense, like, you know, some people were wondering why didn't this happen already, right? The stats show that in the Great Depression, that's when the hours stopped being cut. They stayed the same after the Great Depression, and then they started going up a bit. And then this idea of free time was replaced with the idea of the full employment. And that's where we're at now. I mean, there's some countries that are starting to like reduce the amount of time that we work, like Sweden, I think, like passed a law for 6 hours. But what's interesting is that there's a lot of other things that I didn't mention and we have to think about while we're thinking about this issue. One of them being that a lot of people are deriving their identity from work. So if you spend most of your time basically working, and all of your identities around your colleagues and what it is that you're achieving and so forth, work doesn't only become something that's what you do so you can get like a piece of bread and then go home and like spend it with your friends or whatnot. It actually becomes a social identity. And I have to say, sadly enough, this was up to a certain point, and to a certain extent, basically this was on purpose. I mean, American basically management consultants and management scientists. Sorry, I think Consuelo, I know you were trying to listen, but I think your mic is acting funny, so I'm going to mute you, and potentially then you can unmute yourself because of the weirdness of the mic. Just give me 1 second. All right. So, management scientists had actually realized that it's important for people to feel a sense of identity with their coworkers, and started to create like this family atmosphere. Why? Because they knew they was going to raise productivity. They weren't doing it because they cared about the people as such. I mean, perhaps some of them did, but like the ultimate, goal of productivity. So the reason why I'm saying this is because, when you don't have to go to your job anymore, and you lose that sense of identity, if you haven't found a way to replace it with something else, if you haven't redefine what it means to be free and what it means to work, then it's gonna be like really easy, really difficult for you to like give up your job, given that was where you got your value from. And what's funny is that if you look at the ancient Greeks and other like civilizations in antiquity, they thought that like work was for slaves. I mean, they didn't like working. And of course, in English, basically, you don't have a lot of words for work, but if you look at like French or German or ancient Greek, there are many like words for work. And I talked about this in my last presentation about this issue, but the idea is that there's work that you have to do because of necessity, and there's work that you have to do because of freedom. And we had two different words for that. In ancient Greek, you had doulia or doulia for the one that you had was related with like necessity, and you had ergasia that was related with freedom. So a lot of people do not know what to do with the free time because they were never free. So you have to not only give them skills, but you also have to change their minds. And that's why I think that a lot of people have to start talking about leisure again. There's a great book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, by Joseph Piper, I think is his name, where he talks about how essentially everything that we consider culture was created by people who didn't have to work, pretty much. That should tell you something. These people weren't bored. These people weren't watching Netflix all day. They were actually producing what amounts to culture, not only for the West, but perhaps for the East. So you have to teach people what it means to be free and what activities are worthy of free men. And in some sense, that's what I believe philosophy does, and that's why one of my initiatives, Philosophy Reborn, is about that. But I don't want to perhaps expand too much on this topic right now. I'll probably take another question from Chelsea here. I don't know if she's still listening. She did ask a question on the chat. The question was, what do you think about basic income overall? Am I a fan of it? Well, I already kind of indicated my qualms about it, which is that I'm afraid that it could be a tool from that is used by governments to potentially keep people in a state of slavery. So that's my basic concern, as well as obviously some secondary concerns, whether it's really feasible and so forth. I mean, there's so many arguments going back and forth. I actually held an event about basic income a few months ago, where I invited a bunch of academics and activists to talk about it. One thing I will say, though, to kind of dispel some of the typical fears about basic income, is when we asked a woman who works, Mira, I think her name was, she works basically for a basic income, my basic income in Germany. That's an organization based in Berlin. And what they do is they crowdfund, and then everybody who contributed to that crowdfund gets a lot, and whoever basically wins the lot has a basic income for a year, right? So I asked her. They have already given, by the way, about 80 basic incomes so far to all sorts of people. So I asked them basically, did anyone take that money and just sat around and like watched Netflix, or I don't know, like just didn't do anything, or spent the money on something unproductive? And she did tell me no, no one did that. Everybody basically took that money and did something useful. Some people did some things that were more useful than others, or more dramatic. Somebody checked themselves into rehab. After he was rehabilitated, then he like checked himself into school, learned about IT, and actually got a job even before the money was over. So what you see when people get a basic income is you don't see the kind of fears being instantiated that people have about basic income. You actually see success stories. At least that's what the experiments are showing so far. Even basically experiments that happened in India at villages that were very poor. You saw people starting new businesses and generally like being very prudent with their money. So there's one thing I have to say about real implementations of basic income is that so far they show like some very promising results. My main concern is our dependence on governments who give it to us. That's my main concern. Otherwise, I'm more than happy to like entertain it and based on outcomes, like change my mind. So that's about like basic income. Now, Consuelo basically here says John Hagel, Center for the Edge, is working on these issues. I do follow him on Twitter, but I haven't like read anything by him lately. I'll check it out though. Thanks for sure. And also David Norfors. Yeah, I haven't read much of his either. So I'll definitely check those people out. So thank you for bringing them up. I'll put them in my notes and check them out. Now, I still see like 70 viewers. You could post potentially like a question in the live chat on YouTube, or you could potentially also join the Google Hangout link that I posted on Facebook and have like a discussion live. So like feel free to type a question or like just join in. If there aren't any more questions, or if people are not inclined to join in and have a discussion, I'm gonna like give it a few minutes. Probably like chat with Ivo a bit, before like shutting this down, to give some time for people to ask their questions. So I'm waiting for you at the live chat. I'm seeing it right now, and otherwise like join the Hangout, and I'm more than happy to like chat about this important issue. Right. Have you had any developments in Bulgaria with respect to basic income? Are people talking about it there? Are there any initiatives there?
Not really. Like basic income is something in Bulgaria. Like if you compare we have a technological hub here developing, but one of the biggest differences to say to something like London or San Francisco is that the cost of living is super low. So here actually people can work on a lot of these creative jobs, design jobs, technological jobs, which are like not only for the most technologically advanced people, like also for designers, for many other people like that, and still have a nice lifestyle because they don't need to pay a lot for rent, which is a big problem everywhere. Like affordable housing is a huge thing on this world that we live in right now. So you can actually live with very little. Also, Bulgaria is we're lucky that we have like all these things that are helping out around us. Like we have the mountain close by, we have the seaside close by, we have all these kind of things which kind of give you this lifestyle, which you can, just enjoy life. Culture, there is a lot of culture developing. So here is a place where I think basic income is not that much needed, because you can live with very little and still have this, freedom as you said, lifestyle. So basic income is very important for places where you see a lot of automation taking jobs from people who otherwise cannot live, and live in areas where they need a lot to live, to have like the basic needs they live. Detroit was a big experience. I don't know how it went there, but yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is that like one of the issues that people are bringing up is that when it does start like picking up steam, it won't be long before it spreads everywhere. So it's not as if it's going to stay in the United States or stay like in Japan or whatever. It's going to spread everywhere, and at some point, people are going to be feeling the shock or kind of like the effect. And the question is like, should we start preparing for this even at countries where people are not like afraid of it now, rather than essentially it actually happens? Because I know that in Greece, for example, no one's talking about it, right? I mean, other than like me and a bunch of other like like intellectuals or people. I think like Syriza did mention it once, but they didn't really do anything about it. It was like dismissed out of hand by the creditors and so forth. So Greece, for example, has now like a huge recession, and the recession is primarily due to the economy and the mishandling of public finances. But like it's going to get even worse when like technological unemployment hits basically big. So we'll see. I essentially what I'm trying to say is that I do feel that it's important for governments and nonprofits and people to start potentially thinking of how they'll respond to it. And I'm not seeing as much preparation as I would feel ought to happen given the facts. And even like in countries like Bulgaria, I think like once people start losing their jobs, then they wouldn't even have enough money to afford the very cheap lifestyle they already have. So I do think that it should be an issue for everyone, and we might as well basically start this debate sooner rather than later, so that we don't end up with very rough solutions that might cause more problems than we otherwise would have if we had thought about it more carefully. So
here I think sorry about that, but here I think you made the argument a little bit earlier when you said that here the important thing is what people will do with, let's say, basic income if they have free money, and doesn't matter who give it to them, because I see there is a big problem with the state money because you become a slave, and I agree with that point. But let's say just on the side of you receiving free means to live, what would you use them for? And I think there is a big difference between giving free means to live to somebody who is like coming from maybe a rural place where he or she watched, they are like role model with somebody with a car or something like that, and the first thing they do is try to become a little bit richer, or try to entertain themselves, or try to eat better, or just try to consume. Or somebody who is educated has this understanding of freedom, and I think you nailed the word freedom there by being art, philosophy, having a broad sense of the world and these kind of things. They'll probably be spending it for something productive. And here, I'm a fan of basic income. I think that's a good idea, and obviously it needs to be implemented in a better way via the right mechanisms. But then again, the question is how to more of this sense of freedom, more of this sense of culture, of sense of art, of understanding more. And this could be, many cultural things that are happening, how they reach more people, how people can reach information which is about understanding more, raising their intelligence, raising their awareness of the world. And these are the questions that I want to tackle more, rather than give basic income. Because basic income, I think automation will provide resources that can be redistributed. Again, the question is whether the right person will distribute them, who is the owner of that system, how is the system structured. That's a separate issue, and of course it's super valid. But even if we fix that issue, we need to fix the other issue, which is like, once we redistribute the money, how we ensure that people will be for something, out of freedom. And that's where I think the whole question should be nailed. And this sort of my view.
No, I agree, and that's in some sense like if you look at all the initiatives that that I like launched. I mean, you know, under the idealism and practice vision. I mean, the first one has to do with regenerating freedom, which is essentially like, you know, finding a way to essentially free ourselves from necessity with technology. So that's where a basic income comes. It could be another way of doing it, and so forth. But the second initiative is exactly about what it is that you said, right? Which is, it's called Philosophy Reborn. It's about how can you use essentially philosophy to discover what it is that you can do or you ought to be doing with your freedom. Now, there's like, you know, a massive tradition both in the East and the West of people helping you what life is about, what life you know, you ought to be living, and what things are valuable in life, you know, whether material or immaterial. So the data, if you want to put it, it's kind of like already out there. I mean, there's thousands of books that you can read, but at the same time, you know, I think you're right in that, you know, the data in some sense has always been there. You know, I mean, there has to be like campaigns of outreach so that people know what to do with what options they have with respect to their freedom, and what could be like, you know, productive ways of spending it and non-productive ways of spending it, and not only like from one moral point of view or from one approach, from a sort of like, you know, pluralist point of view, because I don't think there's like, you know, one good way to live. There's a lot of research that says that, you know, we can't like, you know, there aren't infinite ways of living well, but there's a relatively like, you know, interesting variety of you know, good ways to live. And I think people should be exposed to that, respective of what sort of like parts of the world they come from. So that was essentially like, you know, the other initiative. But the last initiative, and this is where things get a bit more complicated, is that assume we do have freedom. No, for some reason, either through basic income or from some other like source, we get it, right? And assume that we start using philosophy and we have decided on what it is that we want to spend our freedom on. There's a last part, which is actually doing it, like living out that choice. And that's when I think things get a bit more complicated, because to live out any kind of choice presupposes a sociopolitical framework that allows that choice, that enables that choice, that empowers that choice. So it's not just enough to have like the, you know, economics or like the economics of freedom. It's not just enough to actually have the philosophy of freedom, but you also have to have the politics of freedom in allowing people to live out the choices that they made. And I think that is even more interesting in some sense, given that I don't think that the current political frameworks we have are really designed for extreme abundance provided by technology. So I'm really looking forward to have a kind of discussion that presupposes that abundance is on the way, technological unemployment is happening, robots and AI are going to take most of the jobs. What do we do with politics like under these conditions? In some sense, like, you know, the ancient Greeks had an artificial freedom based on slavery, and we saw what they did with their freedom. You know, sure, it was based, you know, partially on slavery, perhaps not entirely, but we saw what they could do with freedom. So in some sense, you know, we do have some data points that showed that if people are free, they can like create amazing things. But you don't only have Greece, you also have Nero's Rome or like Caligula's Rome, where people basically just become hedonists and they indulge in promiscuity or license, and they just become decadent. So in some sense, there's no necessity that once you become free, you'll become Socrates or Plato or like Pericles or an artist or Beethoven or something. So you have to start thinking about, okay, we can have freedom, we can potentially use it for productive and interesting purposes, but we also have to start thinking about what are the political, you know, ways that we can organize ourselves so most people or everyone can enjoy it, rather than actually only a few enjoying it and so forth. So these are the three initiatives that make up idealism in practice. So that's why I think in some sense that when I wrote those things up, and you can check them out on my website, I thought that like all these people were gonna come and contact me and like I want to work on this, but apparently people were too busy to even read them. So, I guess I have to make all these presentations to kind of like you know, remind them that, hey, this is important. It's probably going to happen. We have to start like preparing. And I think that you're right in bringing up all of the issues you brought up, and we should start talking or even acting on those issues now rather than later. And not only act, but actually even like enlist our friends and a bunch of others to work on both the technologies and the politics and the philosophy around abundance. So that's that. Let me see if there are any more questions from the chat. I don't see any more questions, and I don't see anyone joining us either. It's okay, it's fine. But I see you posted some solutions and some problems here.
I just posted my notes. Like this is this notes that
I
have.
The education stuff. I mean, like I even like posted a slide about it. Yeah, it's gonna be a really big deal. There's a bunch of people like working on this. I mean, it's gonna take a whole other presentation to talk about this topic, but I do think it's super important. It is encouraging that like you have Khan Academy, Coursera, a bunch of other like online ways of educating oneself for free. Even though I don't think that just a screen and a computer is sufficient to produce a truly educated human being. I had posted basically some ideas like autodialectics and the Socrates software in my website, where I talk about potentially a sort of like a dialectic encyclopedia or Wikipedia, where you can actually talk to the Wikipedia and have an argument about it, have an argument with it, drawing from the wisdom of the crowds and talk with it rather than just read. So there's many like ways to like tackle this. Second is who owned the robots, right? Yes, big deal. There's gonna be probably like a lot of like talk and struggle around that. Third problem, people become jesters of the 1%. Well, yeah, it's already happening, right? I mean, it's not as if like you don't have a bunch of people running around delivering pizzas or like working on Ubers. This is happening, right? And in some sense, like I don't know if you ever read like the moral vision of my Regenerating Freedom like initiative, where it talks about how essentially like once you start asking like the right questions, like okay, like do you believe that people's lives have value, right? Or do you believe people's lives have equal value? And most people would like say yes. And then you ask a second question, like, do you think you should treat what has equal value in a similar way, like in an identical way, right? And people will also say yes that one. So people will say yes, that yes, everyone's life has like value and it's equal value, and yes, you should treat people that have the equivalent value the same. And yet, like how we treat refugees or how we treat essentially like minorities is not congruent with those like two yeses that most people give. So what's interesting is we don't like evaluate people's lives, because I mean, one of the things that I mentioned in that like post was that a person's life, one of the definitions of a person's life is the time that he has from birth till death. That's one. Now, here's the funny part. If we actually agree that people's lives have value and they have equivalent value, then we are actually contradicting ourselves if we start rewarding people's time with a different value. So if essentially like somebody spends like 1 hour and he gets like $100,000, and another person basically spends like 3 months and he gets $100,000, in effect, like objectively in some sense, you're essentially like not counting somebody's life equivalently with somebody else's life. So in some sense, what I'm trying to say is that how would the society look like where you count people's lives as seen as time in an equivalent way, right? How would that look like? Because essentially, like once you give that time away, you can't buy it back. It's like scarce resource. Like it's over, it's gone, and it's not gonna come back. So people are exchanging basically their time which is scarce and rebuyable. I mean, you can rebuy back. With money, which essentially, due to inflation and like exchange rates and so forth, has fluctuating value, and it's a ripoff. It doesn't make any sense. So I do think that perhaps once we start like getting over the market mentality, where essentially in markets people's time is measured differently, and if we do that basically through automation, and therefore people and their time don't matter that much, then perhaps like this will give us a platform to start reevaluating how it is that we treat other people and their time. So I do hope that happens, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it happening automatically unless people start like requesting or demanding their rights and having their time be more respected. I mean, I don't know if you saw this video about time well spent. They're trying to make a bill of rights for attention, trying to say basically like, look, like companies like Facebook, they spend a lot of time trying to keep you on site, trying to keep you on Facebook, because the business model depends on you being there and potentially like watching ads and so forth. So they have like videos that like play one after the other. They have a lot of like techniques where they keep you hooked. But at the same time, our goals as human beings are not to spend like a lot of time on Facebook. Yeah. Nobody would on his deathbed be thinking, oh, shit, what was it that I didn't do? I should have spent more time on Facebook. Hell no, right? And yet all these products, even though they're given to us for free, are engineered to keep us hooked and spend all this time and distract us from what it is that we're doing. Yeah. So in some sense, they're not respecting our free time or our time in general. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say basically is that the more you start like realizing and evaluating properly one's free time and the free time of others, the more like different your product should be and should be designed in such a way that respect is embedded in them. So I don't know. These are like obviously like difficult issues, but I do suggest you check this nonprofit called Time Well Spent, because it talks about how companies, especially tech companies, should start designing products that are more aligned with like human values, rather than basically treating us like rats, wanting us to spend as much time on their platforms as possible, even when it's not really good for us. So anyway, I think we should probably wrap it at this point, given that I don't see any more questions. I mean, I would love keep talking to you, but it's like 11:14 at this point, and I need to eat and probably go to sleep.
Yeah, thank you.
But thanks a lot.
Initiative, by the way, and a very good, it's good ideas, and I think all in the right direction, and important, topics for debate, because at the end of the day, these issues, first of all, becomes an intellectual problem, and then they become sort of something that you actually solve. So,
yeah, thanks for joining, and thanks for participating, and I do look forward to either seeing you in Sofia or Athens or the Global Summit if you're coming. So
coming, unfortunately.
Let's keep in touch, and thanks again for watching.
Definitely.
So bye, guys, and whoever else is watching. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you take those issues into consideration and start talking and thinking about them, because they're gonna be important both for the present and for the future. So thanks again. Bye, guys.